Good morning and good afternoon, everyone. Thank you again for joining us this week for Azure for AWS webcast series. Today, we're going to be talking about implementing Azure Security, specifically implement Azure Security, including authentication, authorization. Today, we have Rafiq Wayani, who's going to be presenting us. And without any further ado, Rafiq, take it away today.
Hey guys, how are you? Really pleasure to have you here.
Apologize for that, folks. We're going to get Rafiq right back in. Looks like he might have a small difficulty in the technical piece, so give us just a few seconds. We'll get him right back in.
Hey guys, can you see me okay?
We can see you great.
Can you guys see me okay?
Yes. Can
Great.
you hear us? Perfect.
Yes, I can.
Thank you.
Thanks so much. I apologize for that. Today I'm going to be talking to you about Azure Security. You know, security is something that has grown drastically and morphed drastically over the span of time, as you are well aware. Our resources and the technologies we use have grown exponentially. Today, I'm going to be talking to you about security from the perspective of Azure. More importantly, I'm going to be talking to you about Azure AD, managed identity, key vault, and app configuration. Right? That's the goal today. Some of the things that I want to kind of impart on you may be things you don't really think about on a day-to-day basis. And there are a few key elements of this equation. The first thing I'm going to talk to you about is essentially Azure AD. And let me share that with you. Having difficulty today. I don't know why. It happens sometimes. Let me fix that. Here we go. So Azure AD is really designed for the purposes of allowing you to have on-prem environments that are or that exist within your own organization, the on-prem legacy applications, on-prem applications and legacy applications. And Azure AD is used to connect that to the cloud world. Yeah, the cloud world. Notice what it says here. It's talking about, you know, your OneDrive, your SaaS applications, and whether you believe it or not, your Microsoft 365 environment is completely backed by or is using Azure AD. Maybe you have Salesforce, maybe you have really any other cloud hosted application. Azure AD is the reason that those applications function and the reason those applications, well, essentially work. One of the things that I do want to tell you is that many individuals that work with AD, or even, of course, Azure AD, they don't really realize some of the key element differences between what I would consider identity and user. Before I can discuss identities with you, I want to separate the identity from the user. Now, you need to have an identity before you're able to have a user. You need to have an identity before you're able to have an account. Account is the stuff that has data. Password is data. Maybe other information associated with the account is data. Now look at it this way. you can apply policies to identities. I don't want to apply policies to Rafiq per se. I want to apply policies to an identity that represents Rafiq, that represents Tom and Bob and Bill and whomever really. And then I can apply policies, and then I can apply policies to the identity. An identity can point to the user that exists in a given domain. If I apply policies, this is one policy. If you notice right over here, this is one policy that is being applied to a couple of users over here, or a couple of identities over here. And these identities point to different, notice that, different users. This is user 1 in a different domain, as you can see. And this right over here is user 1 in the first domain. However, both of these have the same policy applied to it. You know, we deal with policies all the time. Whether something we do or not is a different story, but we are dealing with policies for the purposes of compliance, auditing, security, logs, monitoring, and so on. Without policies, we really would not be able to have effective control over who's doing what. So the concept of identities is very important, and the separation of identity from the account, from the user per se. It doesn't have to be a user. It can be an application. It can be a service. It can really be anything. And that is the difference, if you will, or the separation between an identity and a user, or an identity and an account. The next thing that I want to talk to you about is really involving managed identities, or Microsoft identities, if you will. The identity platform is vast. Microsoft Identity Platform is very, very vast. Okay? If you notice right over here, you end up having your single page application, or your web application, or your API, or your background process for automation, or your mobile app, or your desktop app. It really doesn't matter. All of it can be communicating or be under the umbrella of Microsoft Identity. What is that? Well, it's making it possible for you to authenticate your users, authenticate your services, perhaps your accounts, perhaps your who is accessing what component of your application at what time, what permissions they have. If you notice right over here, we have a single page application. You're able to register the app and then configure permissions of your choice and then give somebody access to it. Web application, similar. You register the app in each instance. As you can see, you register the app, you register the app, you register the app. And I'll show you the process of doing that. You register the app. In the case of web app, you validate the token, you configure the secrets, certificates, passwords, you configure permissions perhaps, and then control access to the web application, provide a token. See that token cache on the bottom? Mobile applications, a little bit different. You still register the application. You then do the configuration of permissions perhaps in this desktop environment. Mobile applications, you register the app and then provide permissions and access. Eventually, you launch the app, allow or deny access to it. Identity, Microsoft Identity, makes it possible for you to configure everything in the cloud. The fact of the matter is, we really are not working with just on-prem resources anymore. Our database application, our web application, our messaging application, collaboration applications like SharePoint, these are all over the place. If some of you guys have been around for some time, you'll realize that way back when you wanted to put Exchange public facing, Microsoft Exchange, the messaging service, if you wanted it public facing, you needed to implement Outlook Web. Remember that? Outlook Web Access, or OWA? And OWA was that web environment, that web authentication, and then you had to authenticate to Active Directory on-prem, find a way to securely get Outlook Web Access from the outside world in, make sure only the people that have access to your Active Directory are able to gain access to Outlook Web Access so that you can get your mail. Remember all that? Those pieces have been simplified. from a deployment, they have been simplified from access. Now, we are no longer just browser-based or desktop-based. We're no longer a single page application. Maybe you are. We're no longer just web app either. We're all over the place. Think about containers and containerization and the scaling of containers with Kubernetes and scaling and clustering and how users are accessing those pieces. Think about how complicated DNS has gotten depending on where you're connecting to the service from, which location, which CDN, content delivery network, which cache you're connecting from, and how you're being routed. The user, the access to the user in production has to be seamless, and that just cannot happen if everything is on-prem. Well, it can happen. You understand, if you've worked with it, it's a very involved process, complicated process, which is what Microsoft Identity makes a heck of a lot simpler. Let me share something else with you here. The other aspect of this is really, what does this do for us, right? Is what does this do for us? And I want to share with you the components to the identity platform, right? There's several components to this. So there is the OAuth 2.0 component, or OpenID Connect. Okay, this allows you to have access to work or school accounts provisioned through AD, maybe personal account for your Xbox, Skype, social and local accounts for business to consumer. And there's also open source libraries, the Microsoft Authentication Library, or MSAL, and support for other standards as well. There's the application management portal, registering and configuring that. There's API and PowerShell. There's developer content as well that walks through this identity component. So there are a few pieces to Microsoft Identity that you need to be aware of. Let me bring up what I'm going to do here. The demonstration, if you will, that I'm going to show you here. Let me create, first, I'm going to create a app service. Right. Here, create a app service. I'm going to create, I have an app service, but I'm going to create a new one. I'm going to walk through this whole thing from soup to nuts, if you will, so that you can see what is involved. All right. So I'm going to create a app service, and I'm going to create a web app. And in my web app, notice I'm creating a web app. Right. In my web app, let me refresh this. There we go. My resource group. Select my resource group. I'm going to call this thing Rafiq Wednesday. I'm going to select my runtime stack, .NET 5, and I'm going to select, I've got my free tier as my app service plan tier. I'm going to be in the Western US, right here. Right. So my web app, my resource group, Azure Demo, my instance that I'm going to be constructing my web app is going to be called Rafiq Wed, and notice the Azure websites.net that's going to get at the end of it. I'm going to click next. I'm not going to worry about automated deployment. I'm not going to worry about application insights. I'm not going to worry about tags, and I'm just going to create my web app, right? And while that is being created, it's building it, I'm going to open Visual Studio. And in Visual Studio, I'm going to create this app on Wednesday, version 18, save that. And I'm going to wait till this is done. So this is creating my web app in Azure. I'm going to go to the resource. Right. Here it is. See that Azure web app. Right. So the first thing I'm going to do is I'm going to make sure that this will work. I'm going to go over to my project. I'm going to go to publish. I'm going to create a new publish source here, Azure web app. open this up. There's Rafiq Wed. Click next and click finish. And then I'm going to publish this. And here it is. The build is starting. And what I'm expecting to see is that page that says the message that I basically indicated here, that hello to web app on Wednesday, version 18. So I'm going to wait till that's done and it's being implemented. Here it is, it's building it out. My output of the web app as it's being published. And once this gets published, I'll show you how easy it is for me to protect, prevent, allow, deny access, utilizing managed identities, utilizing the security components built into Azure. So here you go. I've got it there. I'm going to go over to Edge. I'm going to right click over here. I'm going to copy this link over here. Go right there, browse and copy that link. And here's the application, as you can see, right, with that one message. Okay, I'm going to go over to Edge. I'm going to go over to Edge over here. And I'm going to go down to Identity. Take a look. Okay, there are a couple of different options I have with regards to identity. Identity can be system assigned, which means that the identity is restricted to one resource. It's restricted to one per resource and is tied to the life cycle of the resource. In this particular instance, I'm talking about my application, and then you can grant permissions to the managed identity by utilizing RBAC roles. Okay, so I'm just going to say the other option, of course, is user assigned. I don't want to manage anything at the moment. I'm going to go to system assigned and I'm going to turn that on. And I'm going to save that. And I'm going to enable that manage system identity. Okay. System assigned, user assigned, managed by the system, managed by the user. So here's my object principle right there. Now this is something you want to keep because this is the stuff, if you will, that can get lost. That can get lost very easily. You want to keep track of that. I'm going to put it in Notepad for my purposes. I'm doing something simple. I could implement Azure role assignments if I wanted this to be part of a DevOps pipeline. If I wanted to provide security and RBAC, role-based access control in the Azure environment, to allow, for example, the provisioning of a VM, provisioning of a Kubernetes cluster, a Docker container, whatever the case may be. Right? So I can implement that pretty easily. If I go over to authentication, I can add an identity provider in authentication, and I can specify I'm going to be using the Microsoft's identity provider. I have others, as you can see. I'm going to use Microsoft's identity provider. I can create a new application registration. Rafiq Wed is my application, which is in the current environment. It's telling me what that is. I'm going to require authentication, and I'm going to give it the message forbidden right here. What am I doing this for? I'm basically going to prevent access to this right here. When I am done, I'm going to refresh this, and I want a message that essentially says that I cannot connect to this. All right. So I'm going to use the current tenant, the one that I'm using. I could use any Azure AD on a multi-tenant environment. I can use it for my personal account. I can use personal Microsoft accounts if I want, or Azure AD with personal accounts, or multi-tenant environment. So, but I'm going to use my own tenant, and I'm creating a. I'm going to require authentication. I'm going to click next. Yes, here's a read permission, as you can see. I can add more permissions if I so want, and I'm going to add this. Okay, so it's adding authentication. Here's authentication to be associated with this. Authentication service is Microsoft Identity. It's enable require authentication, and it's going to give a 403 forbidden message if it's not authenticated against AD. Let's take a look at what happens. Notice it says resource you're looking for has been removed. Isn't that great? Go back over here, and I'm just going to edit this thing, and I'm going to disable it. I'm going to click save. Disabled. Refresh this thing and refresh it. Come on. First time I didn't catch it. And let's go. Here we go. All right, we're back to where we were. Okay, so that is a enabling application registration, enabling application authentication. In my case, I enabled web application authentication right over here. I can go over to identity, and I can go over to, I can turn the system manage identities off, say yes. And then I can enable user managed identities, in which I specify which user I want the identity to be for. So see this user managed identities? Now I can specify which user assigned managed identities I want, and I'm going to be doing this via a different source. Let me take a look at something. Let me take a look at my application. Let me take a look at my application. Okay, I've created a subscription. If you notice right here under manage identity. If I take a look at subscription, what subscriptions are, they come down to being able to assign permissions, being able to assign what you want permissions to. Here's giving me access to the permission name, what I want the permission name to be. And if there's going to be a billing profile associated with this and so on, I can, as I add new permissions inside of my subscription, remember subscriptions are associated with my identity, my authentication, and I can subscribe, as you can see right here, is a container that is used to provision resources in Azure. It's the one that holds details about resources like VMs, databases, my backend environments. You identify the subscription it belongs to. When you create a resource like a VM, you identify the subscription that it belongs to, and then you use the VM. As you use a VM, the subscriptions are the ones that are built monthly to have you associated with policies, and you can assign policies to this subscription. You can specify who can and can't access that resource. Maybe it's a VM, maybe it's a database, maybe it's a web server, and so on. I want to show you a couple of other things as well. And before I get to this, I want to talk to you about the importance of what I'm showing you here with regards to managed identity, with regards to security. There are a few things that are rather involved, if you will, as it relates to, let me shrink this. Okay. Think of it for a minute. I am a user, and I use my browser, right? Whatever browser I'm using, and I'm talking about an end user. Now, that user, that end user, just wants to gain access to some web application. Okay. Now, whether that user gets access to the web application or not is dependent on what the security rules and permissions are on that app. And if that web application has a public facing entities not internal to my organization, this user is not authenticated internally within my Active Directory environment on-prem. And it is not authenticated externally by utilizing, for example, Azure Active Directory, then I have to utilize security mechanisms to determine what I'm going to show the user. Okay? So the user that is going to get the view of the web application will be based on security. Now, here's the thing. The user can come from multiple sources. The user can come from, I said browser. This browser can be on a mobile environment, right? It can be my laptop, mobile being phone. It can be my desktop environment. It can be on-prem. Okay? It can be on-prem, and it can also be, of course, be in the cloud or as a public resource. So the browser will be wherever it's coming from. And what I mean to say here, this user may or may not be authenticated, may or may not be authenticated. That is auth-n. Authenticated is auth-n. And authorize is considered to be auth Z. So not only do I want the user to allow or grant or deny permissions to the user, I also want to provide specific access to that user to the components of this web application. Maybe the initial page is what is available to the user as a whole, and maybe after the user clicks on a particular link, that link requires authentication, that link requires permission, that link requires further access. And depending on what resource I'm giving that user access to within that website, that web environment, will dictate what kind of permission I am allowing or not allowing the user to gain access to. So Azure AD, managed identities, Azure AD, managed identities, app configuration. And app configuration is another thing, if you will, an important thing that I want to introduce you to. App configurations, go right up here. App configurations. Right. Have you ever had a need to store your application configuration in the cloud so that you can retrieve certain elements of the application config that are located in the cloud in Azure so that you can gain access to certain components? This all seems cryptic, doesn't it? What kinds of configurations I'm talking about? Well, this can be anything. I'm going to create a brand new app config. I'm going to click right here and I'm going to say Azure Demo. I'm going to call my configuration Web App Rafiq. I'm going to click Create. I'm going to click Create. And I'm going to show you what I mean. I'm going to do a key value configuration. Wait till this thing deploys. It's going to go really, really quickly. What are app configurations? Well, application configurations can be anything you want to retrieve from the cloud, a central source that may change. Maybe that's a connection string, maybe that's a color, maybe that's a font, maybe that's a location of a resource, whatever it may be that you want to store, for example, as an example, in a key value pair. Let me show you. I go to Configuration Explorer. I'm going to create a key value configuration. So I'm going to create a configuration and I'm going to call this thing app color. And I can say that the color of the application I'm going to say is going to be green. And I'm going to say this is going to be for this is going to be for Los Angeles apps. And I'm going to click OK, click apply. I'm going to create another key. I'm going to create a key value, and I'm going to say my next app color is going to be blue, and this one is going to apply to the applications, for example, that are located in Dallas. Why not? Click Save over here, apply that. Okay. And these application configurations I can retrieve, and you'll see what I mean. Do another one. Color gray. Make this thing also Denver. Apply it. Right. If I go up to overview, look right here. That is basically how I gain access to it. If I go to access keys right here, and I take a look at read-write keys and read-only keys. If I go to read-only keys, I can look at the connection string right there. I can use this connection string to communicate with my applications, and I can retrieve those application configurations based on, here's the endpoint. This will basically bring back, and I simply specify what color I want, this connection string, this secret, this ID that I can grab if I so want. Here, primary and secondary keys for reading and writing values. If I go over to my app config, I go over to my resource, I go over to the Configuration Explorer. I've got app color as one of the configs, and I've got 3 different values associated with this. Now, I've got colors. I've got app color. Who says that has to be app color? It can be location of a file, location of a folder. It could be my connect string. It could be any configuration associated with the file, maybe versioning information. If I want that, anything that I want to retrieve that is part of, and I want to store in a central location that I want to grab as part of a configuration of my application that is dynamic in nature. So if you look right over here, I've got 3 values with 1 unique keys. If I create another one, I can create app C string connect to DB on, click apply. Okay, so notice it created a second key value, and I create a create key value appcon string, and then I'm going to do my value. This time it's going to be for web app, apply it. Okay, there's web app dbcon. This way, notice this I put in a single n versus two n's. That's why I created three. So I've got 5 key value pairs with 3 unique keys, 3 in here and 1 in each of these constring and connect string. I can easily edit this. I would have to change the key, but the way to remove that key would be to trash it and rebuild it. If you notice right here, trash the key, say yes, and I'm able to retrieve a centralized keys. What is the benefit of this? This is a way for me to store application level configurations centrally. For me to retrieve these application configurations from a central source. If my application requires application or applications, right? I may have many applications relying on a central resource to be able to grab and gather configurations from. It's not just my own web application, location, versioning, backup, whatever really the policies that I've got in place. Maybe I want to grab certain pieces of the equation. Maybe it's author that I want to grab. I can store these configuration pieces in key value pairs any place I choose, and then I can retrieve them by utilizing these keys, these access keys. Use the read-only keys to take a look at the, if I do this, I'm able to see the values, to be able to look at the connect string, which is what I would use to connect, and basically off I would go. So those are application configuration, and those, and I also showed you the web app that I configured. I also showed you how I utilize the system and user authenticated system identifiers and user managed keys, system managed and user managed keys. So you saw that. I'm also going to show you here key vaults. Right? Key vault. So if you have 2 applications that are inside of your environment, if you have 2 applications in your environment, I'm going to bring this thing up so that you guys can see what I'm talking about. And there is, I will call this thing my web app, and I'm going to call this thing my database. Okay, and I'm going to call this over here my trusted source. Call this my trusting source, my trusting source. And I can create, and if both of these exist inside of Azure, okay, and I want to provide connectivity between them, right there. This connection right over here, the security connection right over here, can be provided by Key Vault. Key Vault can make sure that the trusted and trusting parties applications can gain access to each other utilizing keys, so you don't have to worry about managing those keys. Remember impersonated users in the on-prem SQL Server days, if you will? Remember when web applications were connecting to the web application and you had to, the web application needed access to the database. The web application would impersonate the user on behalf of the database, if you remember, so that you could connect to the database and retrieve the information on behalf of the user. Do you remember all that? Let me show you a little bit. So if I used to have a browser, and the browser was able to access my web application, if you recall, and the web application was connected to the database. And this permission on-prem used to be impersonated. Do you remember that? And then you had to manage and deal with this impersonated user. Remember the iUser that used to be created on the web server? If you remember that, that all of that mess, yes, it is, that mess is no longer needed. Within the Azure environment and within the Azure world, Key Vault can handle all of the communication between and among the trusted and the trusting sources. If web application and your web server is a trusted source, you can specify who's going to be trusting it. Maybe it's going to be the database. Maybe it's going to be some other resources, maybe your APIs, maybe your programmatic resources, maybe your cloud deployments, whatever the case may be. The trusted source can include anyone, anything that you want it to be. If I open up my Key Vault, specify my subscription, I'm going to call this thing Rafiq KV2, leave that. Okay. And here's my pricing tier. I'm going to leave it as standard. And how long do you want me to retain the deleted values? 10 days. Yeah. And if I want to disable purge protection, which means the Key Vault and objects are going to be purged during the retention period. Right? Or if I want to enable it, which means that it's going to enforce mandatory purging, it's possible. Now look at it this way. Once the 10 days have elapsed, notice that right there, right? Once the number of days has elapsed, 10 days, it will purge the protection, forcing all of the keys to be lost. If you enable it, this cannot be undone. And so you have to keep that in mind, right? And then my access policies. What do I want it to do? I want to enable access to VMs or the resource or disk encryption. What do I want to do? I'm going to enable access policy. Now I can have a template around this. I have got templates for what I'm going to be providing access to. Okay, how am I going to be doing this access policy? If I say secrets, I'm going to say I'm going to allow get and list. Okay, get and list. I'm not going to use a template. I can if I want to. I can use certificate and secrets management. I can implement secret management or SQL Server connector. What am I going to be providing access to? I can provide access to Azure Backup or Exchange, basically online. Right? I'm going to click OK. Oh, I'm going to go to Service Principal. Okay, it says select the directory of members. Now remember when I did this over here? Remember? Now it makes me wonder. This one over here. Grab that. Go here. There. I don't think I've got anything listed there. I think I've got another identity that I've constructed. Don't know what I've enabled. There we go. And I'm going to click select. And I'm going to click add. Right. So here is the application identity for my web app and what permissions I have selected. Application identity versus a user identity, which I've also created as well. Right? And then what permissions I've got as a user, as you can see, because this is a admin user, I've got a whole lot of permissions. So I can assign Key Vault permissions to applications. Right? And then what permissions I've specified. Right? I'm going to go over to networking, specify if there's going to be a public or private endpoint or both. I'm leaving both in there. And then I specify tags if I want. I assign tags every single time. Normally, because I want it for billing purposes. I want to know what the object is for, what I'm using it for, to organize billing. Right? So review and create, and end up creating my Key Vault. So that's the Key Vault aspect. It basically allows for permissions to be granted to a internal resource within Azure, so that I don't have to worry about managing keys, managing access of two applications that are within Azure. I don't have to worry about user IDs and passwords, if you will. I can simply specify what application trusts what application or what resource trusts what resource, and I can connect the two together. I specified what's trusting and what's trusted. I specify my permissions. In this case, I said list and get, and here you go. I can go to the resource. And here is my Vault URI that exists right over here. Yeah, and I can specify additional keys if I want to import them. My access policies are listed right here. What I specify for the access policy for this application. Right over here are my permissions that I can select and manipulate after the Key Vault has been implemented. I specify which web application, which service that it belongs to, and kind of off I go. Right? In addition to that, I can also get metrics. I can also get alerts and metrics. Okay? And as I was showing you yesterday, I can export this whole thing, the creation of the whole thing, to my ARM Azure Resource Manager template. And I can then deploy that template to another resource if I want, another tenant if I want, another dev, test, QA environment I want, so that that environment, the dev, test, QA environment, looks exact or identical to mine. So that's the reason that you want to use templates. And that's the reason you want to export all of your resources that you're working on to a template. Now, there's the thing. When you export anything to a template, it gives you a lovely JSON file that will create that resource. And of course, you're able to manage this and manipulate this. Even if I don't want to have a prod environment implemented this way, I store the configuration of everything that I'm doing in ARM templates so that I can go ahead and review and research and analyze how I'm supposed to be doing things and how things are being done. I use it for my own auditing and my own implementation to manage my own configurations of my own resources. That's why I end up using these templates. So even if you don't use it to deploy everything in the cloud, you should, because that way things look the way you want them to look, and they look the way in production, the way they work in dev test. Many times things don't work in production because you didn't really account for all of the configuration elements that you did in your dev test environment. So production looks like dev test looks, aside from the actual data, things would work the way you expect. One more reason to utilize templates, right? So that is Key Vault, that is Azure AD, that is app configuration, that is manage identities. Right? Keep in mind, you want to keep all this designed properly. I can't stress that enough. I'm going to share something with you. I ended up having a very, very long process of discussing and designing my environment. And somebody gave me a really good, simple idea on what's supposed to happen when you're designing and developing anything, whether it's an application, a website, a web environment. And you know, the four pieces of the puzzle you know about that you are able to, or you want to first design something. After designing, you end up developing something. After developing, you end up debugging it. I'm of course simplifying it. And after debugging it, you end up deploying it. Okay. Now each one of these has long, detailed items underneath it, right? Because debugging involves testing and QA. Developing involves a lot of iterations, and designing involves a lot of iterations. The idea is that you want to keep in mind at some point, you want to say that you assign most of your effort around designing, lesser effort around developing, even lesser effort around debugging, and the least amount of effort in deploying what you're doing. When you do this the right way, I'm not saying exactly 40%, right? When you do this the right way, you end up spending a fraction of the time deploying that you do developing, right? These two things should not be flip-flopped, if you know what I'm saying. You cannot spend 30% of your time debugging. You cannot spend 30% of your time deploying, right? If that's really going on, then there was something happening with the design. One of the things that Azure environment does really well is to let you alter and manipulate your design very rapidly in real time. You know what I'm saying? In real time, you're able to change configuration, change resources. You're able to change and alter what you're putting out there and the way you're deploying your application very rapidly. Because why? Because things in real life change. Your scope creep. You know what I'm talking about? Scope creep. Initially, the scope that was created and implemented, as time progresses, especially during the time that you are producing and developing, things come into the scope that are very important. That version 1 changes face and mutates a lot while it's in the process of developing. So that's why you need to design. That's why you want to be sure that you are utilizing these right components, whether it's Key Vault, whether it's Azure AD, whether it's a managed identity or app configuration, you want that fluidity inside of your architecture and your design so that you can manipulate and shift gears very rapidly, right? So some things to keep in mind. I really had a great time talking to you about this. Let me see what questions you have that I can help with. Shalene, Popun, any?
Yeah, Rafik, at this point, there's no questions right now. So if anyone has any additional questions, please feel free to post them.
Wow. I'm glad to answer your questions. I'm here. The complex nature of security has been simplified by doing things this way. For a while there, when we were dealing with on-prem and cloud resources, we didn't know which way to go. Do you remember that? Where we were all on-prem or all in the cloud, and we thought we had to go one way or the other. That's really not reality, right? Things are in hybrid environments. We have some resources on-prem, some in the cloud, and depending on what our needs are, the balance is one way or the other, or it's evenly split. So security is a big piece of that puzzle, right? Key vault, managed identities, app configurations, and Azure AD is a big part of that equation. And as I said, if you're using Microsoft 365, Azure AD is being utilized whether you realize it or not. And Azure AD has been completely re-engineered. It's not a lift and shift from on-prem into the cloud. Yeah.
Hey, Rafik, we had a question come in from Tony. Does the app config allow for disconnected workflows?
Aha. So in short, yes, you can cache those configurations. So there. Yeah. Imagine the possibilities there, right? I'm pretty sure that's what's spinning in your mind. Yeah.
And Rafik, another question that I provided an answer to is there's questions around, there's a lot of options that you've talked through over the past few days. Is there a simple path for simple users, for simple uses for new Azure developers? I pointed them towards the Azure Developer Guide and the Azure Reference Architecture section, but I'd love to have any additional points of reference that they could leverage to get started.
Ah, you mean if they're new to developing in the Azure environment?
Correct.
Sure. I'll provide a great resource. Okay, so a couple of things that I want to share. This right here, look at that. That actually walks through the flows and application scenarios, and way at the bottom of that are examples of where you can get started. Okay. Also, I want to share this with you here. Take a look at that right there. Right here. Right. And this is also something you're going to love. Take a look at these wealth of, see here, right there, the Azure Resource Manager templates on Git. And if you'll notice in there, there is in that Git repo, there is a quick start templates that exist, and you'll see options in there. Also, there are demos inside of that, and it's a very exhaustive list of Azure Resource Manager templates to start with that. So one more thing, so that you can see some easy examples from beginning to end. There are also these right here. So those are some resources to start with, some simple ones to start with. You have a wealth of options. What you're going to find, if you're a traditional on-prem developer, what you're going to find is you're going to say, that's it, that's it, that's it, that's all it takes, that's it. Man, that was easy. I just implemented it and deployed it and I updated it and that's it. That's all I have to do. How do I go back? Oh, look at this. Look at how I do version control. Look at how I do security. Look at how I implement. You're going to say that a lot. Because if you've gone through the pain of doing everything manually, from creating and provisioning a resource to be able to get your environment set up to be able to publish something and get it up there, you're going to find yourself saying that a lot. This is so easy. This is so easy. This is so easy. And you've got examples that are posted to you and that are provided to you that will give you the beginning to end solution for many different aspects, whether it's identity or web, or it is a database application, core application, whatever the case may be.
Hey, Rafiq, we had another question come in. They're asking how to secure access to Azure Key Vault. I know that's a, a broad topic, but if you can maybe summarize.
Yeah, so secure access to Azure Key Vault is done by having permissions assigned in identities. When you create an identity, you provide access to Key Vault within that identity, and then you provide read access, read-write access, and so on. Or from your tenant, you can provide access to Key Vault based on the permissions you assign that user. You might have somebody, an individual that is doing nothing but security, and you can give that user access to just security elements, Key Vault being one of them. So more of a role-based type of a scenario.
Thank you, Rafiq.
You are realizing the right things, which is the key to everything is design, thought, insight, and testing. The benefit is that you're able to change your mind very rapidly and you lose nothing. You're able to change your mind in minutes at the rate of life. And you're able to change your mind and be able to manipulate and shift gears very quickly, whether it has to do with security, whether it has to do with your security model or security implementation, or it has to do with network, or it has to do with storage, or it has to do with your development environment. Anything you have, your moving parts, if you will, you can change your mind anytime and restructure very rapidly.
I think that's it for the questions that we have in the chat window, Rafiq.
All right. All right.
Well, perfect. Thank you so much, Rafiq. You answered
very
many questions today. There's an ample time, I think, to get all those questions in. This is great.
Yeah, the security aspect can get very involved very quickly, and it can get complex very quickly as well. Trying to keep it simple is the key, which is what I was trying to convey.
Yeah, so thanks everyone for joining us today for Implement Azure Security, including authentication and authorization with Rafiq. If you have not registered for the next two final sessions tomorrow and Friday, I did provide the link to be able to register for those. You can join us tomorrow at the same time for implementing API management and developing event-based solutions tomorrow. So very, very exciting stuff. We'll have Rafiq again here tomorrow. Again, I did provide that link to be able to register if you haven't done that just quite yet. So we're happy to host you and see you tomorrow. Thanks again, Rafiq.
Thank you so much. I appreciate it.
Thanks, everyone.
Bye, guys.